So when we're talking about asset management, what we're really talking about is keys. We want to think about the keys specifically and how are they being generated? What was the processes and framework wrapped around all of that? So the first aspect in the asset management specifically talks about that, the key and seed generation. And we're looking for things like, is the actor who's going to be using that key the one that actually created that? Did they do the verification for the software or take some verification steps for the device they may have been using? There's a lot of different use cases here, but what we're trying to verify is that, somebody else didn't make that key for you and hand it to you for use because they may have kept a copy, or maybe their copy has been compromised or stolen and they're not aware of that. So we're just getting an attestation there that that key was created by the actor that's going to be using it specifically. And then we're going a little bit further into the aspect, doing things like validating the methodology around that. So what software was used? What versions was that? What is the cryptographic implementations in there to do the key generation process? And depending on which level we're looking at, there's going to be different requirements for that, whether we're doing those signature verification checks for the software or how deep we're really going there. If we really want to get into the weeds, we start to get into the DRBGs, the deterministic random bit generators. And this really goes deep into the cryptography and how all of the math is working with the nonces and all of the key material that's being mutated and calculated throughout the process. So when we get to that level, we can actually start to look at things like NIST recommendations, right? And industry standards and statistical testing to compare some of this software and these devices to see if they're meeting these types of requirements. As with all key generation, we're also looking at the entropy in 1.0.1.4. And we want to make sure there's sufficient entropy. And I think this really gets into, if you're the Linux administrator type, dev random versus dev urandom, and how many sources of entropy, and are they really truly random or pseudo random? There's a lot of different paths you can take with this. So these are the things that we're really diving into as auditors and looking at and validating the methodology, the process, and then finding out a way to prove that essentially. Outside of the keys, we then kind of expand into the wallet creation. And are we using single keys, multiple keys? These are all the questions we're going to start asking as auditors for people that are looking to certify or comply against the CCSS. How is this done? Who did it? What did they use? What validations went into that process? So for asset management, it really is coming down to the keys, how they were generated, who did it, where are they being distributed? Is that process documented? And can you essentially prove it as an information system or a company or somebody that's looking to adhere to this? So in the first section, we were talking about kind of keys and assets and all the generation and the people and the revocation and the policies and processes wrapped around that. When we talk about the operations category, we're more talking about the operational policies and procedures and audits wrapped around kind of the systems themselves. So we're getting into the things that I think align a little bit more if you're in a SOC world or a PCI DSS world. These are things like, are you doing your security audits and how often are they occurring? Are they vulnerability scans or penetration tests, right? Because you're going to get some different feedback depending on if it's a focused penetration test or a general, wide net vulnerability scan. We talk about things like our data sanitization policy, and there's been a lot of discussion about this. Is it okay if people are sanitizing their own media, and how are they doing that? Are they using vendors, and how are those vendors being certified? So we talk a lot about the policies wrapped around that, the operational procedures that are taking place on a day-to-day basis to ensure that we're taking this secure key material that we've generated in the keys category, in the asset management category. How are we then, persisting with the lifetime of that and removing that stuff and revoking it? How are we doing the audit logs with all of those systems, and where is all of that being backed up to? Because I will tell you, as a hacker, the last thing you do when you leave a system is you're either cleaning up your tracks or you're nuking the system so nobody can find you and do forensics on it. So if you're not keeping backups of audit logs, that may be a differentiator between your levels versus another information system. So these are the things that we're really diving into in the operations category. For the backup requirement of audit logs specifically, as I said, I think in the earlier example, as a hacker, the last thing I'm going to do on a server is I'm going to hide my tracks. So I'm going to poison the logs, or I'm going to delete my entries out of them, or I'm going to wipe the whole system. And if you're a security professional or you're performing forensics to determine who hacked me or how did they get in, or the fact that somebody is even in there, because a lot of monitoring and alerting looks for those log entries and then says, I saw this, ping Ron because there's a hacker in the system, take action now. But if they're wiping those logs or they stop that log service, then you're not getting any of that information, right? You can't perform any of those investigations. You don't have the info you need to piece everything together. And what we always like to see, and this complies, I think, with other different audit frameworks, is your audit log should be backed up to another location. And that should either be a different geographical location. There's a lot of third-party service providers that you can integrate with. And with the difference between the levels, we're really talking about how often are you backing up those audit logs. And everybody's system is different. This is what we're finding as we're having these conversations, is that everybody implements things differently, or they tweak things based off of their product. So when we make that recommendation, I think for level 2 to say periodically, that's really dependent on how your system is built and configured and how your logs are being shipped and how you're zipping all of that stuff up. And you may not have a system where every action is logged instantaneously. So, periodically is going to kind of be up to the auditor and the information system itself on how they're integrating that and what information is pertinent in the sense of an investigation and forensic stance. For level 3, we actually say we want those continually. And if you're doing something like that third-party log service, a lot of the systems I built and architected, log it on the system itself and then immediately send out to a backup server. And that backup server is in another location. So if my building collapses or the server's wiped, I can still go get those logs from that remote location. And because it's continually, it doesn't matter if somebody gets on the system and wipes it immediately. As long as that log entry has fired and has been backed up continually, I can see that the next second in my remote log server and take action or perform a forensics investigation. Without any of that, you are unfortunately flying blind and you're at the mercy of the hackers at that point.